Hello and welcome to the American Family Association Presents. Every day, millions of parents across our country send their children to school in the hopes that they'll get a proper education and become productive citizens. In fact, American society, our government, requires children to attend school. Parents, taxpayers' money goes to funding those schools. So there is a relationship between American society, government, and our schools. And today we're going to be exploring that relationship. I'm pleased to introduce our guest today, Father Philip Eichner. Father Eichner is the president of Kellenberg Memorial High School. He is the former president of Chaminade High School, a post he held for 25 years. He's the former provincial of the Mariba province of the Society of Mary. He's also the chairman of the board of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. Father Eichner, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Frank.
Thanks for coming. Looking forward to the discussion. It is said that probably the three most important institutions that shape our young people are family, church, and school. And with a 50% divorce rate, the family structure may not be quite as reliable as it used to be. We see our society becoming more and more secular, and so there is not as much reliance on the church as there used to be. So it seems that there's a lot of responsibility being placed on our schools to shape our young people. Do you agree with that?
Yes, classically those are the three areas. And a lot has been put on the schools. They want the school to teach them safety, want to teach them socialization, how to relate to people, make them good citizens, make them productive. But I would like to perhaps challenge the thesis a little bit.
Okay.
The real influence on the American child today is the multimedia.
Okay.
That has become the denominator of all those other institutions. The past 30, 40 years, with this increase of enormous amounts of information, visualization, the culture. Students grow up knowing who Lady Gaga is, but not George Washington. It's a very powerful influence that they have, and they're all adept at this type of thing. You see the popularity of Facebook. This communicates a culture, a whole set of values.
The good and the bad.
Good and the bad.
And how do you, on balance, what do you think? This constant age of information, are students absorbing what they should be absorbing, or?
First of all, there is an information overload. And it's basically images, attitudes. Things are caught, not taught. So the image communicates much more than a rational statement. And it has a powerful ability to set their values. What's important, what's not important. The internet is a great tool for learning if you use it for learning. But is it just a question of a superficial, Hollywood-driven type of culture? And that has become a major question. Our culture has, as Moynihan said, it's dumbed down, you know. It's a dumbed down culture.
Let's talk a little bit about that with respect to culture. You know, we as Americans, we have a real debate society. We don't tend to agree wholeheartedly on very much. Yes, yet we are all Americans, and there has to be some type of common culture that binds us together. As educators, how do we decide on what the common culture is in order to educate our students? Where does that come from?
Basically, it came from the American consensus, which has somewhat been under attack for the past 50 years. Our founding fathers had an understanding of what America should be. Any society has an overarching philosophy. That's why they have constitutions, they have bylaws, they have flags, they have symbols to say we believe something, we have something in common. And this common belief is the basis of any sane or successful society. Our founding fathers were educated men, they were lawyers, they were philosophers, and they spent a great deal of time in their lives trying to understand what type of government would we have, what would be the thing that kept it coherent. If you read the Federalist Papers, you'll see the anguish that they went through and the reasoning to try to set up a government that would be effective and would cover many things. Now, our government has a lot of variety of people in it. We accept all cultures. But we do, or did, have an overarching philosophy. Every society has to have, every country has to have a philosophy which everyone adheres to, a philosophy, an understanding, overarching reality.
What was the philosophy of America that came out of the American Revolution of the Founding Fathers?
I think it could not be expressed in a better way than the Declaration of Independence, which I consider really our founding document. And Jefferson wrote, he says, we hold these truths. Now, we means these are the people who want to be American citizens. And we hold, tenacious, we affirm, we attest, we don't guess. These truths, not opinions, not possibilities, but truths, to be self-evident. We're not going to argue them. They're self-evident that all are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. We're endowed. That means our rights do not come from the state. The state, therefore, has a very limited role, an important role, essential role, but it's limited. And the rights that we have come from a transcendent. And that transcendent for our founding fathers was the Judeo-Christian heritage. We might expand that if you want to go a little further and say it was the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian heritage that made America. And that was our founding philosophy. It's a wonderful philosophy. And it brought us where we are today. If you look at Washington's statements and Jefferson's statements, they're very clear about that transcendent. See, without a transcendent, all you have is a group of opinions. It's like everybody having their own rules of the road, their own traffic laws. Everybody can make it up as they go along.
Well, you say that things have changed over the past 50 years. What do you see has happened to some of those fundamental principles and transcendent ideas?
Well, there's been a gradual washout of any Judeo-Christian ethic.
And by the way, again, with respect to education, you're talking about there has to be a starting point. There has to be some sort of common agreement on principles.
Otherwise, you have chaos. Otherwise, chaos. And many schools have experienced that chaos because they can't go back to a founding principle that everybody agrees on.
How did that happen? How did we get there?
Well, it started after the Second World War. And I believe originally it was an attempt to make sure one religion didn't dominate. There was a great fear of the Catholic Church in the 20s and 30s because by that time the Catholic people had become more numerous, had entered politics, had become more powerful. You could just look at the election of 1928, Alfred E. Smith. I mean, it was a totally anti-Catholic vote. After the war, a book came out about Americans and Catholic power. They were afraid of American Catholic power. So there was a gang up against Catholic presence and any religion in public affairs. The case against prayer in the schools. All of this was a movement against the Catholic Church.
Did you see back at that time, was the Catholic Church dominating public education, or was it, again, these principles?
No, they were afraid. They were afraid of Romanism, papism, and very strong a fear of that because Catholics stood together. They were intelligent. They had their own school system. And this was a Protestant nation and not a Catholic nation. And the Jewish community was afraid of any religious domination because they always were the ones who were persecuted. So you understood that.
Okay.
Around 1970, I believe, the evangelical community realized that this movement was not just against Catholic power, but it was against religion itself. And many evangelicals stopped and said, wait a minute, we've been hooked up with the wrong horse.
In other words, the evangelicals had been part of trying to tamp down some of the religious aspect, and now they realized the baby is getting thrown out with the bathwater.
Oh yes, some of the G. Bromley Oxham, some of the Methodist bishops, they were anti-Catholic to the core, and they were afraid. And well, Catholic power was there, and John Kennedy came in the 60s. But by 1970, they realized that we didn't mean that you can't have the Ten Commandments in school. We didn't mean that you can't have prayer in school. And we used to believe this was a Judeo-Christian ethic that undermined, understaffed the whole American project. And now they find out it's anti-religious. There's no religion, trying to get religion out of American culture.
And the U.S. Supreme Court was active in that way.
Very active.
With some of these different decisions you're talking about.
They confused establishment with philosophy and religion. The First Amendment does not get rid of religion in America, it just gets rid of a national established church. But it doesn't get rid of the religion. Washington statements are very clear on that.
So the Judeo-Christian underpinnings of our common culture started to get watered down,
washed out.
Washed out.
I use the image with my students of a piece of plywood. Plywood is a good American invention where we take thin layers of wood, we cross-grain them, glue them together, and we get a piece of wood that is absolutely stable and very strong. The only problem with plywood is that it can delaminate. It can start to layer upon layer, and over those years, layer upon layer of the Christian ethic, the transcendent ethic of Christianity, the Judeo-Christian ethic, was washed out. Washed out. It was delaminated.
Okay.
And if I could say to you that there is only one, I told my students in 1966, I said there is going to be one Judeo-Christian position left when all is said and done. And they always looked at me, what is that one thing? And I said, it's monogamy. Monogamy is basically a Christian concept. Half the world is polygamous. And you might say right now we're seeing sort of that being just washed out. What does the government have to say about marriage? When I tell my students that, well, the government, any government was concerned about marriage because of the future of children. The future of the state depended upon the sanity of the children. So parenting was a concern for them because they were responsible for these children when they became adults. But even now, that has become iffy.
Well, the institution of the family, we talk about not only divorce, but and you're talking about children. Without a mother and a father, there aren't going to be children. We've now seen a change in that. We're now getting into gay marriage.
And who knows, we may have polygamy, we may have three fathers, two mothers. There's polygamy out in the West, it's known, it's published in some of our magazines.
So things are even more up for grabs.
Oh yes, and say it is a Christian concept.
It's interesting, you went from post-World War II, and then you skipped ahead to the 70s with the evangelicals. We left out the 60s, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that. The 60s was certainly a time of radical change, somewhat of a counter-revolution. We're now 40, 50 years out. What do you think? What's your assessment of what the 60s brought us?
I could say I was in a very privileged position. I started teaching in the 50s. In 1962, I went to Europe, to Switzerland, for my seminary studies. I didn't come back in 4 years. It was a time of the council. Being in the seminary at the time of the council was a wonderful experience. When I came back in
The council.
The council, oh, wonderful experience.
Tell our viewers what is the council?
The Second Vatican Council.
Okay.
All the bishops met in Rome, and they were dealing with the church as it was, trying to bring it into a modernization in a good sense of the term. I didn't know what was happening back in the States, because I was very much involved studying in Switzerland, different languages, hardly read an American newspaper. And I come back in 1966. It was a changed world. It was a new world. Mm-hmm. And
good and bad, I suppose. But tell me what your assessment was, not just then, but as we move forward. What do you see coming out of it?
I believe that it was fundamentally flawed. It was a reactive position. They were reacting against types of rigidity. They believed that there's no original sin, there's no evil, everybody's going to be good.
Free love?
Free love, free anything. Free anything. Your rules are, it was antinomian, as we say in philosophy. It was against rules. Rules are negative. They wanted to go back almost to a primeval ooze. Structure is all bad. But I would say, well, you need the bones, you need your skeleton, otherwise you just be a protoplasm floating around, that's all. So it was anti-structural. And I had taken my philosophy very seriously. And I found it was structurally it was rebellion against structure. No structure, no form. Classically, in philosophy, form gives being. Forma dat esse is the Latin phrase. Form gives being. And it was formless. Schools were formless. Life was formless. There was no rules in anything. Rules were oppressive. Law was oppressive. That we are now in a new age, the age of Aquarius, where we can live without rules. Even I saw it at the beginning, before I went to the seminary. I saw it in 1960, 61 with a whole movement against grammar. That grammar is an
another artificial construct?
Construct being imposed upon these innocent little kids to make them to conform to a whole process of thinking and writing and so forth.
Everything was up for grabs.
Everyone. I remember one student says, why do I have to memorize the alphabet in order? I said, well, how would you have a dictionary or a telephone directory if it were all random? Oh. So it was that antinomian, that anti-everything. Everything was for grabs. Clothes, processes, learning processes. There's no curriculum. There are some groups that got rid of curriculum. At Chaminade, they went through quite a liberal phase. When I came there, there were no graduation requirements.
Well, tell me about that. Let's move from, or sort of transition from the historical, societal, how we've evolved, now the impact on education. The 60s, the no rules, anything goes. How did that impact education? What were we going from and to?
It impacted it very profoundly, because there was no longer such a thing as a body of learning that everyone had to know to function as a citizen.
That was all considered now artificial.
Artificial and impositional, and therefore it was open-ended. You could study what you wanted, learn what you wanted. However, there was a counterculture, counter-reaction to that, not because people thought about it, not because it was the philosophic revolution, but people found out it didn't work. It didn't work.
No standards.
No standards.
No accountability.
No accountability, but it doesn't work. For example, do you want to go to a doctor who went to a pass-fail medical school? Oh, no. No. They wanted high standards for their professions. They wanted their cars to work. They didn't want to go to a doctor who said, well, I was having a pot break at that time. I didn't study, so let me look it up in the book. All of a sudden, consequences. There was a reality factor that came in and sort of to put it together. Now, not everybody went that way, so our society became fractured, and it's still fractured today.
Okay.
what does work, and still people who believe that hang loose, Mother Goose, you know. It's going to be an open society, let everything happen that may happen.
Sounds good. Sounds good in theory.
Oh.
As far as freedom, what are you against freedom?
No.
You against free thought?
Yeah. I'm not against free thought, but I'm for thought. Has to be thought, and not just verbalized emotion. Most of what we went through was just feeling that was given words, and then that feeling became a reality, and it had nothing to do with reality. It was just your feeling. Your feeling. And it was a philosophic error of the first magnitude.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because you start with the American Revolution and the Founding Fathers. We move to the societal revolution of the 60s. You said that the American Revolution is one of the few successful revolutions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a famous historian, Roland Bainton, who wrote a book called Anatomy of a Revolution. And he goes through them. He says the only one that succeeded was the United States Revolution.
Why? Why did that succeed?
Because it was not driven by disenfranchised people. It was not driven by people who were oppressed. It was not that type of revolution we're seeing right now in the Mideast, where they have 30, 40% of their people are under 25, and there's no jobs, there's no food, there's no opportunity. That type of revolution, with all the goodwill in the world, doesn't necessarily produce a sane government.
Comparing the American Revolution and that experiment with the experiment of the 60s and that revolution, why does one succeed and one fails?
Because one was thought through. Our founding fathers, they thought through. The other was an emotional revolution, a cultural revolution. It was from feeling. By a generation, by the way, it was amazing to me, by a generation from the Second World War on, that had unprecedented privileges, unprecedented money, unprecedented education, opportunities, care. None of them, their parents went through the greatest generation. Their parents went through the Depression, went through the Second World War, and came back, and we became a most affluent nation. But they rejected it, and there was an anger.
What caused it? Is it basic rebellion? Parental rebellion against parents?
It was a rebellion against all forms of society. Anything that said yes, they would say no. It was the ABBA syndrome. If somebody said A, they would say B. And there were no such things as good art or bad art. There was no such thing as good sentence and a bad sentence. Well, this was your sentence. Therefore, it's good. See, that whole affirmation, even right now, there are many schools, public schools, where you can't use a red pencil to correct, because it violates, hurts their self-worth. There's a lot of consequences to that. A lot of consequences to that.
Did you see the consequences more in the public schools, the Catholic schools, or was it all sort of...
In the beginning,
you had mentioned Chaminade, for instance.
In the beginning, it was all mixed. We really believed that we could have a perfect society without work or without pain, that the negative aspects of life, that people would not choose evil spontaneously, that there was no need for guardrails, everybody's going to be honest. Many Catholic schools the whole society picked it up. Religion, I mean, many
Interestingly, because Chaminade High School, one of the more prestigious high schools in the nation, obviously there was some lore to the philosophy of the 60s. There was something that made an emotional connection. That what do you think that was?
We can have it all without the work. We can have it all. You know, when I was young, I heard this famous phrase of St. Augustine, and it was, ama et fac quod vis. Love and do what you want. And I thought that was a great phrase. Oh, I said, it freed me. till I found out how difficult love was. Love is difficult. Love takes energy. Love takes sacrifice. It's not just the feeling, which the 60s thought it was just feeling. Just the other day, I had a young girl in class, a very fine student. She said, I don't know if I can love if I don't have the romantic feeling. So I said to her, extrapolate now 10 years from now, and you have your first child who's 3 months old and has colic and is crying at 3 a.m. in the morning. There ain't no romance. You get up out of love, because it's a choice of the good.
Okay, so there's emotional, but there is conscious actions.
Choice, yes, that love. And so Augustine was correct.
It's more than a feeling.
More than a feeling. And I found out that to love, to really love, is a life's work.
Well, thank you, and we're about at the halfway point, Father. I want to thank the folks for joining us. We're at the midway break. We're talking with Father Philip Eichner, president of Kellenberg High School, about American Society and Education. Stay with us for an important announcement, and we'll see you in just a minute.